Hey, I wanted to tell you about something that you're going to see in your email inbox here in the next few days, and we will put a link to this in the a description of today's podcast. But we are giving you a chance to give us some feedback about the podcast. We want to know how we can better meet your needs, the things that you're looking for, the things that you want from this podcast. When you listen or when you watch, what are you after? And so there's a link to a survey in the comment section or in the description here of this podcast. You also get one in your email inbox. We would like to hear from you to tell us a little bit about what you think, how often you listen, what are you listening for, and how we can make this better. Please give us that feedback, and we'll do our best to shape this into the exact tool that you need to help improve your walk with Christ. Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading. Then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I am joined by Wendy, Korbusieski, and we're looking at a passage from Psalm 83. And this psalm is a cry for protection and judgment of the enemies of God. Its ultimate aim is that God will not remain silent, but will rise up to deal with Israel's enemies in judgment. And the enemies are described twofold: those who rage against God in Israel in verse 2, and those who devise schemes against God's people in verse 3. So the psalmist categorizes the kind of enemies that Israel is facing at this point. We don't really know the historical occasion of the writing of this psalm, but he is recounting specific nations that have been Israel's enemies in the past. With the same move, the historical enemies of Israel recall how God defended his people against those past enemies. The conclusion of this psalm, though, brings an ironic contradiction to life. So the psalmist prays that the enemies should submit to God. This is a fitting response to the majesty of God. Those who are against God should submit to God. He also prays that the enemies would be disgraced or shamed or humiliated. In this context, humiliation is this pathway to submission. And however, the psalmist also prays that the enemies will die. So here's the contradiction. How can the enemies of God be disgraced to the point of submission and turn to God if they're dead? Simultaneously, the psalmist is indicating that death is an appropriate verdict for these enemies. And this contradiction captures a tension that exists concerning all of God's enemies, right? On one hand, submission to God is the appropriate response for God's enemies. But on the other hand, death and destruction is the appropriate judgment for God's enemies. And in the psalm, there's no resolution. Like the contradictions, they remain unanswered, pulling against one another with no satisfactory conclusion, at least in this particular writing. However, it is in the New Testament that we find resolution to the tension. Because of the cross of Jesus, submission to God and justice upon God's enemies are both possible. The sentence of death, which is justice, was paid by Christ so that the sinner's pride can be destroyed and he could submit to God as his servant. Romans chapter 5, verses 6 through 11 say, "When we were utterly helpless, Christ came at just the right time and died for us sinners." Now, most people would not be willing to die for an upright person, though someone might perhaps be willing to die for a person who is especially good. But God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners. And since we have been made right in God's sight by the blood of Christ, he will certainly save us from God's condemnation. For since our friendship with God was restored by the death of his Son, while we were still his enemies, we will certainly be saved through the life of his Son. So now we can rejoice in our wonderful new relationship with God because our Lord Jesus Christ has made us friends of God. So, Wendy, let's talk about how the death of Jesus solves some of these problems. How does the death of Jesus satisfy justice for the sinner?
I did some digging to kind of satisfy some things in my own mind, and I found a really good illustration that I hadn't had explained to me that way before. And certainly our sin had to have some consequences. What it deserves, or what did and does deserve, was death. And so God, in his infinite wisdom, assigned Jesus as our proxy. And I hadn't heard that word before, as a proxy. And it goes beyond this idea of substitute. So the illustration that I heard was like in baseball, you have a pinch hitter who comes in and hits for you. It's a substitute player. They're batting for you, but whatever batting they do doesn't go for you, doesn't contribute to your batting average.
Right.
They're just subbing in for you. But a proxy is a substitute and a representative at the same time. So as a representative, everything that is done and said is for your record, is on your behalf, is as if it were you. So to be a substitute and a representative, or a proxy in this instance, means that everything that Jesus did, also I did. So it satisfied the wrath that had to be justified, because God is not going to go back on his word. Sin deserved death, and so there had to be the price had to be paid. So Jesus, in order, he was able to do that for us on our behalf.
Right.
So I just thought that was a really cool way to help understand that concept. So he was not just our substitute, but he was our representative.
How did the death of Jesus allow the sinner to submit to God?
In keeping with that psalm, submit means there has to be this level of humility reached. You have to be humble in order to submit, relinquish your pride, and acknowledge your shortcomings. But without Christ, that's kind of meaningless. It's a pity party. Like, oh, poor pitiful me, I suck. But because Christ's death, now that I've recognized that, now I have opportunity to seek forgiveness. That his death allowed me, through that submission, now I have opportunity to reconcile my relationship.
Right.
So the two pieces together, the justification part was met, and then my submission means something now, that I can be reconciled because of his death. So the two pieces work in concert together.
How do you think they reconciled it then, before Jesus?
I think it was a lot more harsh. I think for them, the submission, acknowledging their sin, and that that God was king, the one true God, that submission was recognized by their death. Their death was their submission.
Right.
So I think that's how that would have played out.
Do you think this is still a challenge, even for believers today, that sometimes we're like, they need to get what they deserve?
Yes, there's a little bit of that for everybody, but it's like pick and choose. Like, I want that for you, but I don't want that for me.
Right.
And
we don't want it for everybody. We want it just for a few.
It's easy to dole that out, especially when it's a sin that you feel is just despicable, because it's not your sin, but something that pulls on your heartstrings. But that could be seen conversely as well. Somebody could be looking at you, and what you're doing is like, that deserves.
I had this conversation recently, and I need to be careful how I peel this out, but they were speaking about a specific sin, and what deserved to happen. And I said, well, what about, and I gave a different example. And they said, but they're different. I said, well, tell that to the person who's been affected by that, right? Look them in the eye and say, well, you shouldn't be as upset, right? Because it's not as big as, right, this.
Right.
And they said, but it's not, right? Yeah, but it's big to the person, right, whose problem it is.
Right.
It is. Sometimes people will say, I'm surprised at the things that people become consumed with and want to talk to you about as a pastor. And I said, well, at that moment, that's the number one thing on their mind, right? It's things that you may not understand, right? You may think it's silly, right? But there are probably things that consume your mind and heart, and you want you want my attention at that moment, and you want my compassion and sorrow, whatever. That they go, well, that's weird. Why are you upset about that? And I do think it depends on our own personal experience and the hierarchy with which we place sins, because my list probably looks different than everybody else. There, like for me, typically lying is pretty high up the scale, because I think that's the root for almost everything else. Ultimately your ability to deceive or willingness to deceive people will cause you to commit adultery, steal money, rape children. It's the deception is at the root of everything. So it's not, I don't think you can ignore small deceptions. Everybody else, their temperature is different, and I think some of it is our own personal experience, our own personal temptations, our own personal weaknesses, our own personal frustrations.
Absolutely.
And so I think they dealt with it then a lot different. They wanted you to die, and sometimes they killed you just to do the work of God, right? But I don't know that it's a lot different today. I think we may not want their death, but we certainly want people to suffer.
I think that's part of what, figuratively, at least spiritually, we're called to do anyway, when we're asked to die to ourselves. We're supposed to kill that part of us.
Right.
It is supposed to be slain. Kill it.
Well, Colossians tells us in chapter 3 there are some things we should put to death, right? There are things that you should kill, never to have them rise up again, right? If you put them to the side or you lock them up in a room, they have a chance to show up. There's some things need to be put to death.
That's you trying to fool yourself.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. Those need to be buried. I think they got it right sometimes.
Yeah, that's right. I think sometimes they got it right. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue our conversation around the book of Psalms.